My name's Valerie Bower, and I'm a descendant of survivors and victims of the Eastland Disaster. My great-grandparents were on board, my grandparents, 3 brothers of my grandmother, and the fiancé of one of the brothers. My grandfather, my great-grandfather, 2 great-uncles worked at Western Electric, and so they were going to the picnic like everybody else was. I didn't learn about it until I was about 12 years old. I think it was at the 50th anniversary. And my mother was at the dining room table reading the Chicago Tribune, and they had quite a spread with photographs and that sort of thing. And I had heard on the news about it, and I commented to her what a sad event it was, and she said, and that's when she told me about her family's involvement in it. And as a matter of fact, after she was telling me about who died and who survived, that her mother was pregnant with her on the Eastland.
Did you know any of the survivors that were part of your family?
Well, I knew my grandmother and my mother, and my grandpa died. I didn't know my grandpa. I knew one of my great-uncles who wasn't on board the ship that day, and I knew a great-aunt who was not on board that day. But my great-aunt was the one who had to identify the bodies and complete all of the legal paperwork, the death certificates, and give them all of the information for that. So I knew her.
Whether it was because you knew personally or passed down through your family, what can you tell me about some of the victims?
My grandfather sailed here from Norway as an employee on a commercial vessel and entered the United States at the Chesapeake Bay and moved to Illinois to live with some relatives who were here and had been here for quite some time. His father was an engineer on a ship, so he'd been around sailing all of his life. And when they were on board the Eastland, and they were below decks because it was raining and everything, he knew that something was wrong with the ship. So what he did was he took my grandmother over to a steel ladder and said, "Whatever happens, do not let go of this." So when the ship tipped, he was able to locate her and dive and get her and pull her up by her hair and save her life. He continued to dive for people until the police department said he had to stop. And if he didn't stop diving, they would arrest him. So he had to give that up. My great-grandfather was trapped, and he was in like an air bubble area with a woman he did not know. And when they were cutting through the side of the ship, a piece of the molten steel dropped on his forehead and split his head open. But he had to help the woman out first, obviously. And so he had to help her remove her outer clothing so she could fit through the opening. And so then he was able to get out before he bled severely from the wound, because head wounds are terrible, and the Chicago River was filthy at the time. And so we're lucky that it happened at the time it did for him. And up until they came, he was floating on a piece of wood or a chair, some part of a chair or something like that, in order to stay afloat in the ship. My great-grandfather lost 2 sons. He had 1 son who survived, and the oldest son survived and basically left the family about a year later and moved to different states and didn't stay with the family, and more than likely suffering some survivor's guilt and PTSD. As I mentioned, my great-grandfather was too upset to go and sign the death certificates for his wife and for his children. And the younger brother, who was not on the ship that day, remembers that when they brought the bodies home, his 2 older brothers' knuckles were all abraded from pounding on the side of the ship, apparently, and trying to get people's attention before they died. So it was a pretty horrific death for the 2 of them. As I mentioned earlier, my grandfather was a sailor, and it was always women and children first. And when the ship started having trouble, there was a woman trying to get up the stairs. And another man, strange man, took her and threw her off the stairs so he could get up because he was scared. And my grandfather went to that man and threw him off the stairs and helped the woman up. It was actually a ladder. And he said it wasn't the normal thing to do, but he had to support her by her backside to help push her up the stairs. And he said under normal circumstances he would never have done that, but hopefully he helped her to some level of safety.
It sounds like there's a lot of people who probably owe their safety to your grandfather, your great grandfather.
Yeah. And it is interesting too that my great grandfather remarried a year later to a woman who was a neighbor across the street. Her husband had died preceding the Eastland, but they were very close friends. And so, but she also had lost my great grandma, who became my great grandma, Ida. She had lost family on the Eastland also. And so just in our family alone, you saw the far-reaching effects of it, how she lost a niece. One niece survived, and then the other niece, who was only 17, perished on the Eastland. So there are a number of people who went through, obviously, but in my family, there were a number of people impacted by the loss. And we're just, you're talking about Grandpa being a hero, but he was our hero. And not only was my mom a survivor of the Eastland, but it's medically proven now that a female fetus has within her all the eggs she's ever going to use for reproduction. So myself and my sisters and my brothers were all survivors of the Eastland disaster when you look at it like that. And so we have over 50 family members who are alive because of my grandpa and his experience and his knowledge and his bravery and strength who saved us. And of course, Grandma was a pretty hardy woman and survived all of that at the same time. So, a story about my grandmother who was on board the Eastland. 3 days following the Eastland, on the 27th of July, she was interviewed by the Chicago Tribune and talked about watching her brother and his fiancée go under together in each other's arms. And in 2014, in an op-ed piece, they reran that story of my grandma in the Tribune. And then at the 100th anniversary, 9 years ago, I was at the river throwing the rose petals into the river in remembrance of the family. And I was in the online Chicago Tribune. A photograph of me throwing the roses was on so it was just really heartwarming for me that in 100 years there was a full circle. My grandma was in the Tribune, and then I got my arm and flowers and it mentioned in the Tribune. So that's how all of the work that the Eastland does bring everybody and family members and ancestors together again.